Now, in the last lesson, we created our table view and populated it with 3 hard-coded items for our to-do list. Now, in this lesson, I want to be able to select each of these cells and have it printed in my debug console. And then I want to be able to give it a check mark every time I click on each cell, and then uncheck it if I click it again. So to code this up, the first thing that we need is some TableView delegate methods. So as a challenge, I want you to create the TableView delegate methods below this pragma mark, and it's going to be the one that gets fired whenever we click on any cell in the table view. Now, you've used this method before, so either have a look back or have a quick Google and see if you can work it out. So pause the video and complete the challenge. Okay, so do you remember what the method was called? So as with all TableView delegate and data source methods, the easiest way is just to start writing TableView and see what autosuggest comes up with. And the one that we want is did select row at index path. And as you can see, it tells the delegate, which is this current class, that the specified row is now selected. So that's exactly what we want, right? So let's go ahead and delete that code placeholder, and we're going to print the index path dot row. So this is going to print a number into the debug console when we select one of the cells, and that number is going to correspond to which cell we selected. So let's give it a go. Okay, so let's try the first one. So I get 0, 1, 2. So that's working pretty well. Now, the next thing I want to do is, what if instead of printing out the row, I want to print out the corresponding item in the item array? So pause the video and see if you can do that. So all you have to do is to add item array in front, and then we're going to select the one at 0, 1, or 2. Great, so that's working perfectly. Now there's one thing that I don't really like about the user interface, and it's the fact that whenever I select it, it always highlights the cell in gray, and it doesn't look like how a normal to-do list would function. It would maybe flash gray and then it would disappear and go back to white. So we can achieve that by simply writing TableView.deselect row at index path, which is the current index path, animated true. So now you'll see the behavior looks a little bit different. So now when I select it, it flashes gray briefly, but then it goes back to being deselected and goes back to being white, which looks a lot nicer in terms of user interface. So the next thing we want to achieve is I want to have a check mark next to the cells which I have selected. And in order to do that, we're going to use something called an accessory. So if you go to your main.storyboard and you select your prototype cell, not the content view, but the actual cell, then in the attribute inspector, you've got this property called accessory, and it's by default set to none. But you can see that there's a whole bunch of different things you can have. You can have a disclosure indicator, which indicates to people that if you select this cell, it'll take you somewhere else. Or a detail disclosure, so it has a little info button. Or in our case, what we want is the check mark, which ticks off the item that we have selected. So let's send it back to none so that they're not selected by default when we run our app. And let's add a method inside our didSelectRowAtIndexPath method so that we give the cell that was selected a check mark as an accessory. So let's comment out our print statement and use what we've done here in order to add a check mark. So let's select the table view dot self_row_at_index_path, and this is grabbing a reference to the cell that is at a particular index path. Now, which index path are we going to specify? Well, obviously the one that's currently selected. So that's the local variable here called index path. So the cell at this index path in our table view is going to have an accessory type of dot checkmark. And now if we run our app, you'll see that every time I select a cell, it gets a check mark. But we haven't added any code to remove the check mark. So when I select it again, it doesn't change anything because all we're saying is add a check mark whenever a cell gets selected. And if it gets selected more than once, then we don't have any way of deselecting the cell. So how can we remove the check mark when it's already been selected? So if you want to think about this problem and figure it out, then this is a good point to pause the video because I'm going to show you the solution. So what we need is a conditional. We need an if statement. We need to say that if the table view's current cell at the current selected index path already has an accessory that is a check mark. So if we copy that here, but instead of having the single equals, which is the assignment, we have two equals, which is checking. So check to see if the current cell that's selected has an accessory type of check mark. And if so, then we want to change it to none. But otherwise, i.e. if it doesn't have a check mark, then we want to say add a check mark. So we can now safely delete this line of code. And let's run our app to see if that worked. Okay, so now if I click on one of them, I get a check mark. And if I click on it again, then my check mark disappears. So it's all looking pretty good, right? So now we've added our TableView delegate method that detects which row was selected. And we use that information to check to see if the selected row has a check mark already. And if it does, then we're going to change its accessory to none to remove the check mark. Otherwise, i.e. if it doesn't have a check mark and we selected it, then it's going to have the check mark accessory. So at this point, we've got a very, very simple but barely functioning to-do list app. In the next lesson, we're going to add some more functionality to our app so that instead of just having hard-coded items, we can actually add new items to our to-do list. So all of that and more in the next lesson. I'll see you there.